through. Sometimes when we read about the cross, we don't really appreciate what the cross meant. So we are looking at a medical view of the crucifixion. And we, from a doctor's perspective, I'm a dentist, actually. I'm not a pathologist, but there's enough information available for us today, if you've done some medicine, to get some insight into what happened to the body of Jesus Christ. I'll just ask the technical team if they can to spotlight my video. If you're recording, it's better the speaker's video is spotlighted. So if yeah, thank you very much. So what was the immediate cause of death? This is not clarified in the Gospels. At that time, they didn't have the kind of information we have today. But as we look at the accounts of the Gospel, and also from archaeology, what's available archaeologically today, and also what's available in literature, in writings, it's possible to piece together what happened to Jesus. I've looked at a number of medical writings. I've also taken the liberty to illustrate with the different pictures. So please don't get perturbed that the pictures of Jesus don't look the same in different slides. But I try to pick out the images that best bring out what we are talking about. So let's get going. A medical view of the crucifixion, or Christ's death under medical examination. We need to go back to the last 24 hours of Jesus' life on earth in the physical body before the resurrection. It has been said that most, probably 75% of the prophecies about his life were fulfilled in the last 18 hours of his life. Right, so that is Martin Lloyd Todd, I think it is, view of the Last Supper. That happened less than 24 hours before his death. Remember, the Passover meal was served in the evening, probably around 6 p.m. at the beginning of the day of Passover. The Jewish day begins at 6 p.m. So at 6 p.m., the day before he died, Passover began. Excuse me. So this was the last Passover Jesus would observe on earth. And the accounts are given by three of this, well, the Gospels talk about them. There are some details there which would form very interesting reading. This is because usually when we think about what happened at the Passover, I don't spend too much time on it. We have this view. We have a different view, and that's the view that we have. Leonardo da Vinci, very famous Last Supper painting. But that could have been true, but it does appear that Jesus spent his Last Supper in an upper room, we are told, and the upper rooms were used by rich people. If you've been to Jerusalem, there's even a place that they show you that's likely with the upper room. These were wealthy people. And if there were wealthy people living in a city where there were Romans, they probably had a different way they would sit at table. They would not sit at table, they would recline at table. When you understand that, it's very interesting to see the events of the Last Supper, who sat at his right hand and left, how could they dip food, and so on. So just suffice it to say that Jesus had a meal. He had a meal which he shared with his disciples. They were probably lying more like that at table. They used to lie down at table, not to sit at table. And that made it easy for people serving in the middle. They would come in that middle of that almost U-shaped image there. And you can see archaeologically, that's what's called a triniculum. It was a place for feasting and lying. They would lie down on the left side with the right hand free to partake of the food. And again, just to make a comment, that is probably what the setup looked like in that room. With Jesus and Judas and John on either side. So anyway, after the meal, approximately, we know a number of things happened during that meal. The washing of the feet. John gives us a very long account of what happened. And then it says after they finished, they left, they went down the Kidron Valley, walking to the Garden of Gethsemane at the foot of the Mount of Olives. As they move down, Jesus tells the disciples that he's a true vine. John records this in John 15. There were probably some vine vineyards there, so he could actually give them visuals. He offers his last words of encouragement. John again gives us that account. And so they arrive at the Garden of Gethsemane. And then he calls Peter, James, and John to stand and watch while he prays for about 3 hours. We know that the disciples, though they were asked to stay awake, quickly fell asleep. And although he initially prayed that the cup of suffering awaiting him would be taken away, he finally accepts whatever the Father wills. Now, St. Luke, who wrote the book of Luke, he was a doctor, and is the only one who tells us about the body bloody sweat. Luke chapter 22, verse 44. That he sweated like large drops of blood. It looks like very weird, but this is now been shown in medical literature to happen. Very rare. It's a phenomenon called hematidrosis, or bloody sweat. It is documented now. It happens under great emotional stress. So he's not the only one who has had this. There are people who it has been documented. When someone is under, this just gives us an idea of how much stress Jesus was under. Great emotional stress. Then tiny capillaries in the sweat glands can break, can rupture, and therefore mix sweat with blood. As the sweat is coming out, it is bloody sweat. Now, that tells us that Jesus was under immense stress. Sometimes we say we are stressed, but I don't know how many of you have had hematohidrosis or hemohidrosis or hematidrosis. You can look up that term later. You can note it down and look it up and read around it. So this times of extreme stress also produces marked weakness and shock. And Dave Miller, who has a PhD, a quote from him, says that during the last years of the 20th century, there were 76 cases of hematidrosis that were studied and classified into categories according to the causative factors. And the most frequent causes of this phenomenon seem to be the acute fear, when somebody is terrified, or intense mental contemplation. The blood loss is not much, but it results in the skin becoming very, very tender, painful, and fragile. And this would have meant that the blood was really on the surface. And you can imagine what was to follow when they began whipping him. So just to let you know, if you're listening today, you're undergoing stress, Jesus knows all about it. He knows more than you can ever imagine. And so you can go boldly before him and say, Lord, on that day you were greatly stressed, and I'm under stress. I know you understand. Help me. Why was he stressed? He knew the death he was about to die. The death itself was a horrible death, as we're going to see. But more important was that for the first time since the creation of the world, he knew that he was going to be, well, not even the creation of the world, from the first time in eternity, he was going to be separated from the Father and the Holy Spirit. That was just unthinkable. He also knew that he was going to carry on his body the vilest sins mankind would ever commit. And those things must have, it's difficult for us to even imagine what he went through. But extreme stress from the Garden of Gethsemane. So around midnight, his captors come, they roughen him up, they come with clubs and swords. And they were told they came with clubs and swords. Those were not for decoration. They came fully intent on using them, and I'm pretty sure they used them after they arrested him. So at around, probably around midnight, it's not very definite. We can only, or maybe approximately, because if he was arrested around midnight, sometime in the night, maybe around 2 a.m., they take him. Judas arrives in the Garden of Gethsemane, accompanied by armed officers and other men that have been provided by the religious leaders. And Judas gives him a kiss. You can read those accounts. And they grab him. The disciples run away. Peter tried to put up a fight, but Jesus stopped him. So he's left alone. John tells us about a young man who ran away naked. He's probably talking about himself. They grabbed his clothes and he took off. Now he's first brought before Annas, the father-in-law to Caiaphas. And Annas questions Jesus about his disciples and his teachings. And he was not using politically correct language. Jesus answered him in what they thought was not religiously or politically correct language. So while he was there, the priest, before the priest, an officer slapped him in the face. That is given, an account is given of that. He's not yet under a lot of physical abuse, but the account of a slap is given. I don't think it was a little slap on the face. It must have been quite a hard slap. And Annas then sends him like a common criminal bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. And at this point, they don't have any evidence. They're trying to get evidence to condemn him to death. They can't get it. And remember, they're not in charge of their country. The Romans are. So if someone's going to be murdered, they want to be seen, especially religious leaders, to be on the right side of the law. But we are told they spat on his face and they boxed him. So that's trial number one. He's dragged to another trial. It's happening. Remember, he has had no sleep. Actually, Jesus didn't have any sleep in the last 24 hours. Should we say 48 hours or so of his life, or 36 to 48 hours. So he's taken to the high priest's palace for what will be the first of 2 trials before the high priest. And also remember that the people who are assembled there are only those priests, elders, and scribes, and the like, who hate him. Members of the great council, the Sanhedrin, council members like Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, who believed in him would have defended him and not at the trial. So at this time, false witnesses come. They accuse him of threatening to destroy Jerusalem's temple. He does not respond to the charges. Frustrated that he's not commenting, he's not saying anything, Caiaphas calls upon God to witness his answer to the next inquiry. So I'll just quote here. The high priest answered and said to him, I put you under oath by the living word. Tell us if you're the Christ, the Son of God. Jesus said to him, it is as you said. Nevertheless, I say to you, hereafter you'll see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. Now, when he said these things, Caiaphas tore his clothes, this was against the law, by the way, if you read what is mentioned in Leviticus 10:6. But he tore his clothes. He accuses him of blasphemy, and he immediately asked the council for a verdict, to which they unanimously shout that he deserves to die. But they now have to take that and convince the political leaders that he's deserving of death. This is the time where Peter denies them 3 times. But we note here that they also failed to get any evidence. They tried and tried. They pitched all kinds of questions. I'm sure they had the best interrogators if possible. And Jesus just kept quiet. So they got so frustrated. Again, they begin to roughen him up. So it's now coming to morning. The Jewish law demanded 2 sessions of the Sanhedrin to hear and try a defendant. So a second trial of Jesus was held around 5 a.m. in the morning. This was more like looking for a rubber stamp or an automatic approval of the first trial's decision. They bind him, send him to Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor of Judea, for punishments around very early in the morning, around 6 in the morning. So he has been up from the Last Supper. He's been abandoned by everyone. He's alone in a very hostile surrounding, and he's been dragged between 2 homes. Now they bring him. Now at this point, Judas, who had hoped that he would do something, comes to himself and realizes that he has betrayed an innocent man. And so we're told he hangs himself. He hung himself and goes and throws the pieces of silver back to them. And then he hangs himself. So let's go to trial number 4 now. This is before Pilate. Very early in the morning. Pilate is just woken up. We know later his wife had a dream in the night, which really troubled her. He's battered, bruised. He's with the sweating that happened, a lot of sweating caused the dehydration. He's dehydrated, worn out. He's had a sleepless night. So probably 6, 7 in the morning. They couldn't have gone at 6 to the governor's house, but very early in the morning, they appear before Pilate. But they now have to bring a case. Instead of blasphemy, saying that he's called himself the Son of God, they bring Jesus under the charge of treason. They say he's committed treason against Rome because they're looking for a death sentence. They want the Romans to do the dirty job of murdering him. Pilate questions them. He asks a lot of questions. And he then realizes that these guys are just here because of jealousy. There's really nothing. So he tries to shift responsibility to Herod when he discovers that the man is from Galilee. Said, oh, Herod from that area is a tetrarch of Galilee, was son of Herod the Great. He's around here. You send him. At this point, before Pilate, apparently there was no mistreatment. Jesus had to be presented to the leaders. And by the way, when you study what happened between what we call Palm Sunday and this time, he was presented, the chief priests. Matthew gives a very good account. The Pharisees they found no fault in him. The Sadducees, they found no fault in him. The lawyers came, they had no fault. Everyone came until they all went away. They had no fault. Now the religious leaders actually had no fault. Now the political leaders had no fault. So Jesus was being presented like the Passover lamb would be presented. The high priest from the days of Moses had to comment and say they found no fault with the lamb. And here, all these different categories of people find no fault. You'll find very interesting comment in the book of John by Pilate at the end. Says, take him and crucify him, for I find no fault in him. Powerful words. He didn't realize he was prophetically saying the very things that the high priest would say. And so Jesus was declared fit to be the Passover lamb. No one could find fault in him. All right, so he's brought before Herod. So Pilate sends him to Herod. We don't know how far away they live from each other, but it was in the city of Jerusalem. Herod is very keen to meet him because he wanted to ask him questions and perhaps ask him to perform some miracles. And Jesus is really not saying anything, Jesus is quiet. So his soldiers mock him. They put a splendid robe on him and they send him back to Pilate. They just didn't have the fun they wanted. Again, at this point, apart from mocking him and so on, there's really no mistreatment. So now Jesus has to go back to Herod. Now, this is where the story begins to change. Herod tells the religious leaders that Pilate tells the religious leaders that both he and Herod find him innocent. And Pilate wants to release him. And at that point, at some point, his wife even comes and tells him, don't have nothing to do with that man because I had dreams about him, But before the Passover, it was customary for the local Roman authority to allow the crowds to pick one prisoner to be freed. So Pilate decides to use the custom to have the crowds choose who was to be set loose. So he picks up the wildest character who maybe a common thief and a violent robber and all that. And he's saying, obviously, let them choose. They'll choose Jesus. He has nothing wrong with him. But the people who are stirred up by the chief priests, they cry that Barabbas should be freed. Pilate knows that the Jews delivered Jesus because of envy, but he tries no avail. And so he washes his hands before the people to signify that he's innocent. And then he releases the Barabbas. Now, this is where the bodily suffering of Jesus begins. As I go through some of these things, I just want to say we are looking at a medical view. If you find this a bit too much for you, maybe you just not look at the screen, but listen. But this is what our Lord went through, and sometimes we make the cross look so beautiful. It was ugly. It was ugly. It was the worst death you could go through, And when you're handed over to be crucified, you are handed over to ruthless guys. In the book of Psalm 22. Which is a prophetic messianic a psalm about the death of Christ on the cross. He says, the bulls of Bashan are surrounded me. He's completely surrounded with the wildest characters possible. So from this point on, Jesus is handed over. The to the soldiers, and the scourging begins. They put a purple robe on him. They put a crown of thorns on his head. They mock him, "Hail, King of the Jews." They spit on him. They slap him. They hit him in the head with a rod. And remember, that rod had thorns. So they are driving thorns into his head. And if you've ever had a wound on the head, the head has a lot of blood. So those spikes, the bleeding from the face must have just been terrible. It was a bloody mess by the time they were through. Now imagine you've been scourged, they put back the cloth on you. You know how blood clots on the clothes, and then at some point they have to rip that off him again. So you can just imagine what was happening. Pilate's still having second thoughts, but the people would have nothing about him. So they take him and crucify him to the road towards the crucifixion, the Via Dolorosa. He's sentenced to death. Now, so I just want to give some more graphic information about this whole question of the scourging. What they would do, as you can see in the image on the upper right, okay, I've used two different images. They would tie the prisoner, whoever it is, to a post above their head. And they would strip them naked. I know that we want to give our Lord dignity. And so even through this process, we picture him with clothes, with something around his waist. Jesus was stark naked. That's the reality. The Romans had no time for that. If you're a criminal, the reason the crucifixion was put there was to show everyone that this is what will happen to you if you behave in a certain way. And it's even made public. They would hang the people outside the city, the gates, the city near the gates, so that everyone passing by would see and just say, I don't want to be in that place. So the dignity of a loin around his waist and all the stuff our painters try to do, really, I appreciate the dignity, but they would strip them naked. And then they used what they call a flagellum. And there's an image there. It was a heavy leather short whip with heavy leather thongs, having two beads of lead attached near the end of each. And they also attached things like bones and hooks and all kinds of other things. So they would bring the whip down on the back of the prisoner that way, coming down, as you see showing here. And as this happened, with a lot of force, and if you've seen The Passion of the Christ, the movie, they try to depict this, and initially this cuts through the skin, but later it gets to the layers below the skin. And bleeding would first start with the capillaries, the smaller vessels and veins. Then as it got deeper, it would get to the arterioles. So there would be a lot of bleeding. The skin would end up in ribbons, just torn apart, a mass of torn, bleeding tissue. And often the prisoners would be released near death. They have bled a lot, they are exhausted, they're tired. And the person is weakened, Isaiah 53, if you read Isaiah 53, which was also fulfilled, both Psalm 22, the whole chapter, more or less, and Isaiah 53 were fulfilled at this time. So they finish off with this scourging. He's lost a lot of blood. And John tells us about how they mocked him, they gathered around him. And a company of soldiers, 1/10 of a legion, probably there were quite a number of men. That would be like 300 men or so. They just had a party on him, if I may use the word. This crown of thorns was placed on his head, more bleeding from a very, very vascular area. And Mark and Matthew both tell us that they struck the crown of thorns with the staff again and again. So they were driving these thorns into his head. And any time that, I mentioned about the robe being removed, I've already mentioned that, more bleeding. So he now has to be taken by walking, by his foot. He's carried. Today we see prisoners being carried on buses under high security. Sometimes they even flown to places. But they took him to a place called Golgotha, also known as Calvary, the place of the skull, to be crucified. And this is where we read about Simon of Cyrene along the way, an African who was forced to carry the cross. I had a commentary from one time where somebody said that the Romans were too proud to carry the cross. The Jews were too religious. They got somebody from Africa to carry the cross, and who helped him carry the cross. He fell down a few times, and this was, someone also said that the angels must have held their breath because he had to die outside the gate. And he had to die at the spot, at the particular spot, which may have been the very spot that God had told Abraham in the book of Genesis, that you take your son Isaac and out to a place I'll show you. There's a specific spot. It's not mentioned that way. I will not be surprised to find that the very spot where Isaac was about to be sacrificed, because God told him, your son, your only son, the one whom you love, that spot must have been the very spot where Jesus, years ahead, was crucified. It was among the mountains of Moriah. We know it was in the area of Jerusalem. So anyway, he had to die at that spot, and it is not worthy that somebody from Africa helped carry the cross for the last leg to the point where he had to die. God has Africa on his heart, and I'm sure we shall see that in the years to come. All right. So we will now go to Via Dolorosa, where he has to carry the cross. I'll share something about the cross, the type of cross that he carried. The convict was required to carry the cross, also called the patibulum, the beam. I'll explain that in a moment. The execution site outside the city. And the execution site was equipped with many stipes. Stipes was the part that goes down to the ground is called stipes. So the part that he carried, I know today we see him carrying the cross like that. No, it was not like that. There was a part that goes into the ground called the stipes. And the prisoner carried the horizontal part around his shoulders. So even this image here is not quite correct. And they would carry it to that point, and then they would nail them to the cross, to the stipes. So as Jesus fell, the wood would gorge into the skin, which was already bleeding. The muscles of the shoulder, remember, they have been scourged, so they are already one bleeding mess. There's a big wound there. The muscles have been pushed beyond their endurance, you know. Sometimes in church, we talk about even lifting our hands. You can't lift up your hands for 5 minutes. But Jesus' body was stretched, And as he's moving here, the women are weeping. Jesus is offered wine with myrrh. So it's a mild analgesic, medical language, painkiller, a pain reliever. He refuses to drink it. We don't know why exactly. It was meant to reduce his pain, but it seems he preferred to meet his death with all his faculties unimpaired. He made a decision for you and me. Now, this is the method of crucifixion. The Jews didn't kill by crucifixion. The Jews killed by stoning. But the Romans are the ones who use crucifixion. But the first use of the cross was by the Persians. Alexander the Great, when he conquered that area, and these generals, they brought it to the Middle East, the Mediterranean region. They found it to be something which was effective in sending terror among people. So they imported that to the Mediterranean region. And the Romans were very good at picking up things when they took over from the Greeks. They perfected it. They brought it to a degree of efficiency and skill. And in Roman writings, a number of authors like Livy and Curie, they comment on it. It was a method of executing the worst criminals used by the Romans, who were then in charge of the world. It was a very brutal method of punishing a criminal. It was designed to bring about a slow, painful death so that the criminal would not leave the world in a hurry. Sometimes it took 3-4 days to die. And only slaves and the lowest types of criminals were crucified. Very, very rarely were Roman citizens crucified. We know from the accounts that Paul was a Roman citizen. When it came to death, he chose to be beheaded. Peter chose to be crucified upside down. So the upright portion of the cross, called the stipes, as you can see here, that part which goes down, okay, had a cross arm attached to it, called the patibulum. That's the part you see the prisoner carrying across their shoulders. And this was the type used in Jesus' day. The type used, shaped as the letter T. So that's you can see that. And there's excellent archaeological evidence. As I was looking through this, they have now dug up graves and so on. They even see where the nails passed on some of the bodies or skeletons that have been dug up. So the stipes, the vertical part was fixed to the ground, and usually they kept those at the crucifixion site. And the condemned man carried the patibulum from the prison to the execution ground. It weighed about 50 kilograms. 50 kilograms is what? Just over 2 jerry cans. It was not light. So imagine Christ with all that he has gone through carrying this. And again, I want to emphasize, even if there was a robe around him from the point of the prison, at this point, he was stripped completely naked. He was laid on the ground with the crossbeam under his shoulders, and his arms were stretched the maximum, and were nailed to the patibulum, which was then raised and secured to the stipes. Just a comment about his shame he went through. If you read Matthew's account, Matthew says the women stood far away. Yeah, I haven't quoted it here, but you can read through Matthew's account. You'll find it. The women stood far away. Why? Because they could not, just a sense of dignity. They stood. It's only his mother who came near the cross. The other women couldn't. Their Lord was absolutely naked. The other women came. I mean, they stood out. It was only John and the mother who came. The others stood far away because he was completely naked on the cross. He became poor. He lacked all things. He had nothing, as that we may have all things. This is what Christ did for us on the cross. So the crucifixion. Now, Roman historical accounts and experimental work show that the nails were pierced through the radius. Now, if you're medical, you know there are two bones here, or even if you're not medical, there's the radius and the ulna. So if you pierce the hand right there, the weight of the body would tear through. The person would not hang on the cross for long. The weight of the body would just tear through the flesh. So they found out where to pierce here. Some people indicate that they probably went at that point there, but the accounts show that they probably went between. Now, with their important blood vessels and nerves that pass here. So the pain of the nail going through between and going through the nerves there must have been quite something. And then once you're stretched out full, then the legs are then pulled their maximum and crossed on top of each of the other, and then nailed to the bottom of the cross. So long nails, as I said, some of the pictures are a bit gory, but this is what happened. This is what happened. The victim's name and the crime were nailed to the cross above the head, and Jesus was nailed King of the Jews. That was his crime. The reason they put that there is to show people, all the people, it was on a road. So as you walk by, you see on the cross and say, what did he do? So you just learn what not to do. You don't want to be in that place, And it was crucified between two thieves. The Romans cast clothes for him. They cast lots for his clothes. And there was a type put there, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. The Jews objected to it, but Pilate said, what I've written. So I want to avoid some of the details now so that we can keep with the medical side of things. The rest you can read about. We know that darkness covered the entire land for 3 hours. It was an eclipse of the sun. And this is where he talks to his mother. And a few things about the cross. They allowed the convict to hang on the cross for public display. And as I said, it served the two purposes. One, allowing the public time to scorn and mock the convict. And secondly, to teach others the consequences of disobeying the Romans. If you misbehave, we get you, we'll put you here. Okay. And he's tired, the weight, the whole weight of his body is on the nails. He's not, the weight is there. So the whole weight, I don't know how many kilos Jesus was in his earthly body, but that whole weight is on the nails. It's still alive. So there's a fiery pain going through the fingers, the arms, getting to the brain. There's a nerve there, the median nerve, if it was not pierced by the nails, it is being pressed. And because of the sharp pain, the tendencies, you want to push yourself up to ease the pain. But then as you push yourself up, there is pain on the nails on the feet, because that is also between the bones, the metatarsal bones. If you're a student, I asked some of the students to join. You studied anatomy. The arms are getting tired. They are beginning to get muscle pulls, cramps. There's sharp piercing pain going through the body to a point where you can't push yourself up anymore. It's just your whole body is one big pain. Breathing is becoming difficult. The muscles are unable to act. So air is not coming out properly. You're slowly suffocating. Carbon hydroxide levels are increasing in the lungs, the blood streaming. And as carbon dioxide increases, the cramps may begin to subside. And then he cries out, my Lord, why have you forsaken me? At some point, the veil breaks into two. But I want to skip those things and just stick to the medical issues here. Now, it was a time of the Passover, and they did not want. There were some things about leaving a body hanging before that. During that time, they wanted to quicken the death. Okay. Because they wanted him off the cross, out of the way. Of course, Passover had begun. They were going to the Jewish feasts now. If you remember the Jewish feasts, you have the feast of Passover, which is followed by the feast of unleavened bread, which runs for 7 days, and then within that feast, that 7-day or 8-day period, you have the feast of first fruits. So it was a special time. They ask Pilate to break their legs. Now, breaking their legs would quicken death, because then you can't even adjust for breath. You just suffocate. So when they came to break the legs, Jesus' legs, those who were crucified with Jesus, their legs were broken. We read about that in the reading today. They found that he was already dead. But as we read today, they did something. And so he was already dead. Just to ensure that the person is dead, they would pierce his side. But he has gone through hours of limitless pain, cycles of twisting, turning, trying to avoid pain in this area, cramps, suffocation, trying to breathe, pain from the back, which has been torn, which is now rubbing against the cross, by the way, but that back has been torn by the scourging. And they pierce his side. And that piercing was actually a piercing. They had to get through the lungs, right through the lungs, to the heart. And many physicians actually believe that the water was the fluid that had gathered around the heart, the pericardial sac surrounding the heart. So water and blood flowed out of the side. Jesus, by now he was dead before the wound was inflicted. And this supports the view that the spear that was thrust between his right ribs, perforated not only the lung, but also the pericardium. It went into the heart. And that was a way of ensuring his death. And so just before that, would have known then, with that the pericardium around the heart began to fill with the serum, and basically were crushing the heart. If you read Psalm 22, verse 14, it says, my heart, says something about his heart turning to wax. His heart is even struggling to beat, he had lost so much fluid, and to come to a point where his heart was now struggling to pump thick blood to tissue. The lungs were struggling before he died. And so he got dehydrated. And at some point on the cross, he says, I thirst. I thirst. Now, I just picked out these as well as I come to a close. Some of the statements he made on the cross, just every one of those statements were made out of a lot of pain. At that point, you don't want to even talk. You don't want to expel any breath. You're kind of just, But for him to say any of those words, those were important words, very important words. We can study the 7 statements of Jesus on the cross. And one of them is to forgive. Why would he bother? Can't he forgive from his heart? Why would he have to try and push himself to get breath and then even say, Father, forgive them? Very powerful lesson for us, because the people he was asking to be forgiven, we're not asking for forgiveness. They are mocking him. That's just a point about the breaking of the legs. I think I've already mentioned that. For Jesus, he did not need to have his legs broken. He was already dead, and that's why they pierced his side. And according to the Bible, Exodus chapter 12, verse 46, the bones of the Passover lamb were not to be broken. Numbers 9:12, Psalm 34, verse 20. And so God made sure that his bones would not be broken. As we saw in the reading, blood and water came from the pericardium, came. Most of the deaths on the cross were a result of hunger, exhaustion, and suffocation. But if they had performed a post-mortem at that time of our Lord, they would have concluded that he died of heart failure due to shock, the constriction of the heart by fluid in the pericardium. And the fact that he died only 3 hours after being put on the cross shows that he suffered intensely before he was crucified, because typically death on the cross was meant to be a slow death. And if your body was fairly strong, you'd stay on the cross for a long time. But for him, he was dead in a very short time. Probably about maybe three or so hours, because it's crucified about 9 a.m. and by 3 p.m. rather, so it's done. So what follows then by the way, because this death by crucifixion was so cruel, history has that in the year 315 AD, that was almost 300 years, over 300 years after Jesus died, the Romans themselves decided that the cross was too brutal. They were still practicing it, and they decided to abolish it. The Romans excelled in brutality. So we have an account there of Pilate, who allows Joseph of Arimathea, who was a rich member of the Sanhedrin, to take the body of Jesus. And Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, they wrap his body in fine linen with a mixture of myrrh and aloes, and they bury him in this brand new tomb that Joseph had made for himself. So brothers and sisters, today as we commemorate the death of our Lord, this has been a bit rushed, but I do pray that the Lord has given you some insight into what he willingly went through. At any one time, he could have called the angels to stop him, to deliver him. He could have called a legion of angels, as he told Pilate, but he decided not to. He decided not to take any anesthesia or analgesia, anything, any pain relief. In our day, would have taken Panadol. He decided not to, so that he would experience it and carry your sin and my sin. And if you're on this call today and you have not yet received the Lord into your life, I pray the Holy Spirit will speak to you, not just out of the sense, but to carry of sympathy, but to know that he did this. He didn't have to do it, because in fact, if he had not done this, Jesus would be alive today, because the wages of sin is death. The only way death could enter his body is if he had sinned. Otherwise, death could not touch him. But the moment he agreed to carry your sin and my sin, death invaded his body. And perhaps because he was carrying such a large amount of sin, past, present, and future, we can only imagine what we may not even be able to imagine properly what he carried, what the intensity of what he went through in his soul and in his body. But there are hints. There are hints from the Garden of Gethsemane, and then we have hints from the Gospels and from historical records what the crucifixion was like. And the reason he did that was so that we could become children of God. And I pray that if you've heard this message and you've not yet made a decision for Christ, today will be your day where through his death, new life is offered to you. It's up to you to take it. You can choose not to take it as well. Thank you very much. I'm sorry I've overshot a bit, but I pray and trust that God has spoken to all of us. God bless you. Thank you.